Welcome to Lesson 2 of Population. Now, today's focus is on the global patterns and classification of economic development. So my 4 questions to you are, how do we classify countries based on their economic development? How do we measure economic development? And is this the best way to measure the development of a country in general? And finally, what are the global patterns that are emerging based on economic development? So during the Cold War, from 1947 to 1991, there was a way of classifying countries into 3 different categories. So the first world being the capitalist countries and also considered the developed regions. The second world being the communist countries. The former Soviet Union and China were examples, but also Cuba, North Korea. Third world were then considered the other countries found in sub-Saharan Africa and South America. Now, there were a lot of terms used to classify these countries that are now considered outdated. First world, second and third world being some of them, but there were also terms during this time where the third world was labeled as undeveloped or backward countries or underdeveloped. Now, this caused offense to many people living in these countries because it implied that they were inferior. So then they came up with the term the less developed countries, meaning to convey that they were developing but not as developed. So this obviously failed to address their concerns. And Willy Brandt, a German chancellor, termed or drew a line across a world map, calling it the Brandt line, in the 1980s to highlight the divide between the North and South, using GDP as the way to divide countries. As you can see, Australia and New Zealand ruined the perfect North-South divide by being located in the Southern Hemisphere. So the North being the rich, South being the poor. Again, failing to address the concerns of other countries. And so now we view countries along a continuum of development. So we use the terms developing and developed. Now, there was a term that tried to identify developing countries more positively, using the term the human resource rich countries to basically emphasize that poorer countries have a great asset in their human resources. In other words, they had larger populations. This didn't really take off, but we are seeing rapid economic development in countries that were formerly considered the poor countries. Now they are rapidly developing as newly industrialized countries. And part of it is to do with their growing population. We'll talk about that more in the next few topics. So there are so many newly industrialized countries and they've been clustered into many different acronyms. You might be familiar with BRICS because remember we talked about it in tourism. So Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. But since 2024, it also includes Saudi Arabia, not Argentina, remember, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and United Arab Emirates. So there are altogether 10 countries in BRICS. Now, the successors to BRICS was MINT. So that includes Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey. These are smaller economies, but they're bunched together because they have large populations, but also suffer from corruption and political instability. Civets include Colombia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Egypt, Turkey, and South Africa. Again, considered rapidly developing economies with large young populations. So large proportion of their population under 30. There's the next 11. Now, Bangladesh, Egypt, Indonesia, Iran, Mexico, Nigeria, Pakistan, Philippines, Turkey, South Korea, Vietnam. These are considered the fastest growing countries, economies in the 21st century. So notice that Turkey is in both, it is all in all three of Turkey, civets, and the next 11. Similarly, South Africa is in BRICS and civets, so they overlap. And you will find all of this in your course companion on page 390. Make sure you go to that page and have a look. There's also the centrally planned economies, CPEs. These are socialist countries under strict government control and also considered former communist countries. That includes Libya, Belarus, Cuba, North Korea, Iran, and Venezuela. China was also part of this until the 1978, when it opened its economy and became a hybrid capitalist and communist country. And the same goes for Russia. Oil-rich countries, they would otherwise be considered LEDCs without their oil reserves. And then recently industrializing countries such as Chile. Watch this 9-minute video. It's found on your worksheet on quantitative economic indicators so that you can distinguish between GDP and GNI and GNP. So these three are quantitative economic indicators, but more recently we are seeing some more holistic ways of measuring economic development. This composite index. Now, composite meaning it comprises of multiple different indicators in health, education, and economic participation, and it combines to form an index. So a new way of indicating the economic development. We also talked about purchasing power parity. Remember, looking at measuring prices of the same good in different locations can be used to explain the different purchasing powers across different regions. The higher the purchasing power parity, the higher the buying power of a country. So using the Big Mac index as an example, we can see Australia has relatively high purchasing power parity, with a Big Mac costing $5.28 compared to Malaysia's $2.89. Imagining that they were using a universal currency, right? All right. In the worksheet, we also talk about how economic development is measured using a range of indicators. So we've just discussed quantitative. There are also qualitative indicators, such as welfare policies. Australia has one of the best welfare systems, where we have large unemployment benefits. Same goes for France, where 30% of its GDP worth is used, the government spends on welfare. And Finland, a lot of Scandinavian countries, Nordic countries, and so forth. Then you've also got security and composite indicators are another way of measuring economic development. So the Human Development Index, for example, combines the quantitative indicator of life expectancy, expected and mean years of schooling, as well as GNI per capita to form the HDI. So these are the three areas it values. This idea of looking at countries in a more holistic way, and not just measuring, a single, not just using a single indicator such as economic growth, but considering health and education as well. Similarly, the multidimensional poverty index is an interesting one that you can find on Codrington, page 21. Looking at it in more detail, we're measuring health and education using nutrition, as well as child mortality, years of schooling, as well as the amount of schooling that they're attending, and then standard of living. So cooking fuel, do they use dung, wood, charcoal, or coal for their cooking fuel? So what we can see here is that the weighting of the health and education area is about 3 times more than the standard of living, right? It's 3 out of 18 here compared to 1 out of 18. So some of these areas are qualitative, some are quantitative. There's also a way of classifying countries based on income. This is the most up-to-date data from the World Bank. So low income, lower middle income, upper middle income, and high income are classified based on GNI per capita. So if your GNI per capita within a country is less than $1,145, then you are considered a low income country. Lower middle income, between 1,146 and 4,515. Upper middle income, 4,500 to 14,000, and then 14,000 and above. Gross national income per capita is considered a high income economy. So when we look at our case studies next lesson, it might be worth looking up what is their GNI per capita and then classifying it in your written work. These are two really interesting graphs in worksheet 1 that I want you to write 2 interesting observations about. So notice how each graph is different here. Okay, what are they measuring? And what are some interesting trends over time between 1994 and 2018? What are some of the things that stay the same? And what are some of the things that are changing over time? All right, so write down some observations. You're going to share them with me next lesson. The next thing I want you to do is match the glossary terms for these following concepts which we've discussed, and then read Codrington, page 24 to 28, and fill in the tables. So over here, we're looking now at, you should have finished this, and we are looking at here, write your 2 points, and then write down some information on factors that are influencing economic growth. So cultural contact in Codrington, we'll talk about colonization in African country of Mali, for example. It was exploited under French colonization. Mali's resources were exported at low prices, such as their gold reserves. Trade, financial flows, transnational corporations, which we've covered before. So there's some good interconnections here. Write down a couple of notes, specifically looking at those example case studies, and then answer these questions here using this graph and your background knowledge now. All right. If you have time, get ready for your presentation on Wednesday for the last part of our tourism unit. Thank you.